Hi folks, I'm Paulo, and in this video we'll talk about how to containerize your application and the overall advantage of doing that. For the purpose of this video, we'll be using IBM MQ on top of a virtual machine running CentOS 6. MQ itself is on version 8 and will take as is and migrate to a container. So we can get rid of the platform, of the old virtual machine platform. Later on, we'll migrate to MQ9 so we can get MQ itself at a supported release. So to start, we have to think on what exactly is a container. A container is kind of an evolution of the standard Linux root.jl capabilities. So you have a skeleton of your operating system with all the base files, base libraries, base components that the application will need to run. And you run this skeleton inside a root.jl environment at a container host. At this enhanced root.jl environment, we isolate the namespace of this application, so even when you do a PS, you do not see processes outside the root.jl. You can limit the amount of CPU cycles that the application may consume, IOPS, memory, and even network connections as well. You can isolate that application to a specific IP address through different methods. Considering that the basis for a container is a root.jl, the first step is how we can get all relevant data from this CentOS virtual machine inside this directory to run the root.jl. And to do that, well, we can use the command tar, which is natively supported by Podman and Docker for the matter. So we can pack all files that we have on the source virtual machine and unpack as a container image itself. So we have here our virtual machine, which is running CentOS with MQ on it. I think first step will be, well, let's stop MQ. Ensure that all our important processes are down. And let's get ready to create the tar file. But actually, before we create the tar file, let's create a checkpoint here. Touch. I was here. That file will be interesting for us to check after we are inside the container. With all relevant applications down, let's go back to how we create that. However, Podman and Docker have a few limitations on how we can create this file. We cannot have duplicated files inside the source tar file. In other words, inside the server itself, during the import phase. So if we have duplicated file references, we'll have an error. That can happen mostly when you have mount points. In this case, the only external file system will be /boot. Why that? Well, because we have the /boot directory inside then we have /boot directory inside the /boot file system, so we have two entries with the same name. I think that's the only instance here, but to ensure this kind of scenario, we created a script called findDup. The script will connect to the server and do a fake tar to ensure that we are getting everything. We'll We'll isolate that only to local devices, so NFS shares or temporary file systems are not coming to the tar file itself. And we'll sort the output of the tar command, count the unique references for the files, and exclude every file that has a single count as reference on the file system itself. When we execute that, we see that we only have duplicated references to /boot. There are other ways to find this kind of data, but anyway, after we know the duplicates, we can actually create our base image. The one that will help me create this base image is actually this create base. So we'll do an SSH to the server again, issue almost the same tar command, except that this time I'll exclude the devices itself. We don't need devices at the container because it's just a skeleton with the binaries. We'll exclude /boot, otherwise we'll get an error. We'll exclude temp because I don't want to bring temporary files. And we'll exclude lib modules because, well, we don't have a kernel anymore, so we don't even need the drivers. And even if we had both, there is no way to load a kernel module inside a container. Keep in mind that this is a root jail inside a different namespace, so you don't have full access to the kernel. We will limit this to only the local file systems, so we don't go across NFS shares. Not that I have any here, but anyway, we don't go there. And we pipe the output of the tar data. If you take a look here, I'm outputting the tar file to standard output. So I'll do a pipe here and send this directly to Podman using the command import. Tag this with a message old MQ8 environment. Define that the startup user for this container will be root. And as a best practice, we'll establish that /var/mqm will be treated as a different volume. This way, in the future, if we want to split this into different images, it's all set. I'm also instructing the podman to fetch the tar contents from the standard input, and we'll call this image the old MQ8 version 1.0. If we execute this script, it may take a few minutes because, well, it's a full server that we are packing here. But while it runs, let's wait. Once the image creation is completed, we already have the base for our container, so it's just a matter of start it. So let's take a look on how we do that. And to do that, well, I have another script to help in it. This script will start Podman and export a few ports, basically 1414, which is the standard MQ port, 9157, 9443, 22 in case I want to start a privileged container that will have root access, and that means access to ports below 1024, for example. I'll set the name, the host name of the container itself as CentOS, so we don't change that. And here we are referencing our base image that we just created, and we'll start /bin bash. It's important to understand that we don't have a fully fledged operating system here. That's just a skeleton. So we don't have init, we don't have startup scripts, and alongside of that we don't have DNS services, we don't have the postfix that we had back there, we don't have external authentication out of the box. So if I need LDAP on this container, I'll have to start the LDAP daemon manually. We don't have DNS cache, we have nothing, just a skeleton to run our processes. So let's start it. Oh, and there is one last thing. If this bash command dies, the container dies with it. It's the same way as a Linux would shut down without the init. Here, the bash is the init. So I strongly advise, if you go this way, create a script to start everything that you want inside the container and keep the script running for the life cycle of it. It's up. As I said, there is no external process. I cannot see what I have in the host. Now that file that I created is still here. So it's a nice thing that we still have it. Let's start our MQ server to see if it still works. It works. And here it is. Now the thing is, if I exit this specific shell, I'll shut down everything and we lose the whole instance that we just created. So what I do, Ctrl P, Ctrl Q, admin, PS. Here is my container. It's exporting our standard ports. Let's try to connect to it. It's connected, nice. Now the thing is, if I want to re-log into the shell of this container, how do I do that? Admin exec -it, the container ID or container name. In this case, I'll be using the ID and another shell. This way, I'll be logging at that naming space. By logging, I mean I'm creating a new bin bash command inside the same naming space that I have the container itself, which grants me the same functionality as I was logging at it. If I do a PS, I'll see my new bash command here, my PS, and the MQ there, which is nice. With that, the MQ8 have been containerized and we are midterm on what we are trying to achieve. With that said, well, we are still under MQ8 and we are still not supported. How do we migrate that to MQ9? Well, bottom line is not doing this. Let's take a step back a little. IBM offers a way to migrate from any MQ8 Plus to MQ9.3. There are several considerations like functionalities, like how your QE replication is designed, if you are sending messages from one QE to another MQ server, the whole MQ cluster architecture itself. So I strongly recommend you to read through our MQ migration guide so you ensure that you are not forgetting to adapt or actualize any of your needed capabilities. To migrate our specific use case here, I created a script based on the recommendations that I followed on the IBM migration guide. And this script will take essentially our authentication methods with an MQ as a shell script. It will dump out the runtime configuration from MQ into an MQ script. I'll also save out the SSL certificates here. So in case I want to reuse this, in case I want to reuse my certificates, I can. I also advise against this because usually on legacy installations you have legacy certificates like TLS 1.0 or even TLS 1.1. We have newer TLS methods like TLS 1.2 and TLS 1.3, which MQ9.3 supports and are way safer. Here I'm exporting all policies in case I have any. In this specific case I don't have it. It's a quite simple MQ server. And here I'm dumping all local messages that I may have in my system. So I'm searching for local QEs and I'm dumping messages that I may have in these local queues. This will come interesting later on. So first thing we have to do is, well, let's copy this script to our MQ8 environment so we can export everything from there. I was doing this before to test that everything was working. So MQ export. First thing, well, we have to restart our MQ server, otherwise there is no way to connect to it to dump both the messages and the configurations. Let's create a dump directory so we can dump the contents of the MQ environment. And as this is a really small system, the dump have finished. And we have here this directory export that we'll need later on. Back to our host. Let's ensure that our MQ8 container is not running, because we'll use the same ports here when we start the 9.3. So podman q, that will kill the container. It's like power off on the server. And let's copy all this. Let me remove the file that was the directory that I had here before, and let us copy the dump contents from the virtual machine to here. With this, we can reference the standard container creation example from IBM website, which will translate to this. We fetch the container image from the IBM public repository. This is a public repository, but it's an authenticated one, so ensure that your user has proper access to this image. Then we'll copy this MQ script that we created during the dump itself to the container using this specific name here, which will be used to initialize this new queue manager. Then as the user root, we'll create the user MQM and the group MQM and add that to the root group. This is not really needed. I just like to do a PS and see names instead of IDs, but it's not really needed. As I was using local authentication in my virtual machine and I want to preserve that, here I'm creating a user for myself again, and I'll copy all those messages and policies and certificates from this machine here to the container itself, and switch the running context to the user MQM inside the container itself. To create it, podman we use the command podman build. We'll create this new container here, we'll load the roles from this container file, and we'll scan the local directory for any additional files that I may need. For example, this file here and this file here. If I run that, it will execute everything inside the container file, and our container is ready to be executed. If I do a podman images, I can see that I have both my old MQ8 container and my new MQ9.3 container here. You see that the new version is quite smaller as well, because we have only the bare minimum needed for MQ to function. We don't have a fully fledged operating system here. And even when you consider a fully fledged operating system, 4.6 gigabytes is not that much. It's way less than the 100 gigabytes that I had on the virtual machine. And to start it, I have to export a few variables and start essentially in the same way I was starting the other one, with one difference. I don't have to specify an init process or a fake init script to it. When IBM created this container image reference, this one here, IBM defined the entry point and the standard processes that should be started during the container startup. So it's something that you shouldn't have to worry. The only things that we have to be worried here is define the name of the queue manager. So we match everything again. And set up the MQ admin and MQ web interface passwords. Inside a container, it's quite hard to start an MQ Explorer, for example. So IBM released a web interface for you to manage the container, to manage the MQ inside the container. This is the default password for it, at least the password that I'm setting. If I start this, it may take a few minutes to finalize the startup. But once it's done, we'll see a message that it's fully up and running. Queue manager started the web server, which is basically the web MQ Explorer per se, and the listener have been started as well. One thing that you have to be very careful is this will import all your configuration from MQ8 to MQ9.3. It's expected that not all policies, not all settings will be imported transparently because you have functionality changes between MQ8 and MQ9.3. So be extra careful with the contents of this initial output. Any outstanding error will appear here. And I think I have one here that if this was a production environment, I should double check. As it's not, I'll ignore because this is related to the way that I authenticate into my MQ environment. With this finished, the next step is, well, let's see if I had messages to import into my MQ system. So admin. The way to access the container naming space is to the same. Admin is IT. Inside the container, I see the MQ here running. It should be MQ9.3 as I defined it into the image itself, and it even show here that it's MQ9.3.2.1. The local keys that I had are here already, so should be mostly fine. When I unpack this, it will show me the certificates. I had none on my system, but if I had, would be in the star file, and I would have a tar here to unpack everything. Then I have another thing here, which is basically my dump message import command, so it can import the messages I had in my MQ system back to this new one. Most of the QEs were system QEs. I don't want to import this. It's not needed in my case. I want to import just my two personal queues here. Each one of those had a single message that I put there just to test. And with this, I think the migration itself is completed. Again, you should test this before you commit to production, so ensure that all policies, all settings have been applied properly. And now let's log on the web interface so we can check how our new MQ environment is showing everything. Once we connect into the web interface, we will see a warning because I didn't install the proper SSL certificate. The container bootstrap process created a new certificate for me. Let's accept. It will load the web interface. The default user is admin. The password is that one that I set at the variable. I don't want to save that. And with this, I'm at the web interface. It may take a few seconds to load, but we'll see that, well, we have no warnings. It has almost all capabilities that we had on MQ Explorer. And here I have both my messages that I imported from the original MQ8 environment that I had. If I take a look at the configuration, we'll see that everything was mostly imported properly. I think there is only one thing regarding authentication that I would have to check if I want to actually move this to production. With that said, let me actually go back here. This modernization path is completed. I think the only highlights I have to leave at this video is, if this were a production environment, ensure that /var/mqn is on a different volume, so you have decoupling between the binaries of the container itself and your data. So in case IBM release MQ9 you don't have to go through the trouble of exporting and importing everything again. It's decoupled already. And if you had no TCP/IP connectivity to your MQ, it may be interesting to review how your client channels are defined, so you ensure that you don't lose connectivity between your MQ client and your newly deployed MQ server. And I think this covers all points I wanted to present for this exercise. If you have any question, concern, or anything, let me know, and we'll try to sort that out.